Hey y'all, I'm James Wright, and welcome to my floor. Today we're working on a vent. Let's dive in. Not literally. So a couple years ago I put in this floor, and I put in the vent here, which I thought was great, it looked nice, except for this vent is, well, yeah, it's pretty well trashed. And I always thought it'd be kind of nice to put in a wooden floor vent, so let's see about that.
Now, it's very important to note that the entire floor is white oak. And if you want to see this, I actually did a video a few years ago when I installed it, putting it all in by hand, and then planing and scraping it by hand. It was a good bit of work. So we're going to continue this madness and make a vent by hand. I have a lot of scrap white oak, and so I figured this would be a good addition to it. It's a slightly different color, and I don't have any more of the finish that I used on the original floor. So it's going to be slightly different in appearance. And that's okay, because it is kind of something I want to highlight as opposed to just blending in what's around it. And at some point in the future, I will refinish the floor and smooth it all together, and then it will all be one finish. But for right now, we'll go with something a little different. I'm cutting these down to make the strip around the outside at 2 inches. This will be the frame that everything fits into. I'm shaping this out so that the hole in the middle is the same size as the actual vent ductwork, and then the frame will be 2 inches bigger on all sides as a border. We're going to miter this together, and the frame itself will sit on the floor, and then all the hash mark will extend into the frame, and that will also sit on the floor itself, so that it is supported by the subfloor that the whole flooring is sitting on. We're going to joint them all nice and smooth, and then bring them all down to the same thickness, and then we are going to miter them to match, just like a picture frame. I like to start with a miter square and draw out what the 45 should be, and then I cut it close to that line. I'll stay a little ways away from it because I want that line to be just about exact. It's most important that the two short sides match exactly together and the two long sides match exactly together. The actual length and size of it can vary a little bit. I haven't cut any hole in the floor, and I'm not cutting anything to match, so I can make them whatever they need to be at this point. So I'm just going to cut them slightly larger than they need to be and leave them rough, and then I'm going to take them over to the shooting board. I used to just freehand them, and I would freehand them to the line, and that actually works really fast. But if you've got a shooting board that's set up like this, this works so much faster, and it's just incredibly nice to put it on there and measure it, and every time they come out dead on, exactly 45 degrees, and it goes together without a gap in it. A shooting board is an amazing thing if you're ever doing frames. It's pretty much a must. And I've got several videos on making the shooting boards, as well as a collaboration with Rex Kruger. It was a lot of fun. So for putting it together, I'm going to be gluing it with regular wood glue. I found this to be just about the best on ingrain. I could do it with epoxy, but in this case, it really doesn't need a lot of strength. If these wiggle loose over time, then they wiggle loose over time. There really isn't any direct benefit to getting them together. So I'm just going to glue them and then put them in a frame clamp and squeeze them up, let them sit. And I really like the frame clamp. It makes these just incredibly easy to put together, and it tightens up, and very, very happy. I want to make sure the inside is square, which it should be with the 45 connections, but then I can start to figure out how big is the hash work going to be on the inside. For the hash structure on the inside, I had a whole bunch of different designs and different things, and most of them had small pieces, but I want this to be structural because it's right by the door to the outside, and so people are always going to be stepping on this vent. And one of the problems with the last metal one is it just got crushed in. So I'm going with something that's a little more sturdy, but it has a little bit of a Frank Lloyd Wright feel to it. I want to make sure all the sticks are 3/8 of an inch thick. I actually made them a little bit thinner than 3/8 of an inch thick. As long as they're all the same thickness, that's what's important. And then I'm going to lay out the long ones, because the long ones are going to be the structure. That is what is underneath everything else. They will rest on the floor on either side, and they will hold up all of the little pieces in between. I had thought about going the other way, and there's reasons to go one way or the other, but I decided to make the long ones the structural pieces. So I'm going to actually mark on here where they will intersect with the body, and then we'll mark out the 3/8 for the next piece. And the hash, I'm putting them all 3/8 apart, so that there's an even look, and then in sets, top and bottom. And you'll see how that works in just a moment here. But we're just going to be laying out on this, finding where the middle is, and then move 3/16 to either side to give you a 3/8 gap between the two lines. And then once I have the middle one, then I can lay out halfway in between those ones, and then halfway in between those ones, and you can start to figure out where these need to be. It's also very important to put X's and notch outs on your markouts. You want to make sure that you have, you know where you're taking material off and where you're not. Otherwise, you're going to have to go back and remake these pieces. The nice thing about these is that they're all the same. There are 4 that run lengthwise, and those are all absolutely identical. And then there are going to be 10 that are short and run separately, and so those are all identical. So I'm going to put them all up into a vise, and I marked one of them, and I'm just going to transfer all those lines across with a square. Once I have these lines on here, I know all these pieces are exactly what they need to be. And before taking it out of the vise, I'm going to go ahead and cut them. I want to do everything I can with them all together. I put down a depth mark with a marking gauge, and then we can cut down to that depth, halfway down to it, making sure I stay in the line. I want to leave the gap in between so that the outside of my cuts make the thickness of a board. If that doesn't make sense, just hang with me. You'll see here in a moment. So we're going to cut these all down to depth, and then we can remove the waste in between the lines. And this is honestly where a lot of the fun comes out. I really enjoyed this part of this project because there's a lot of this chop out. You cut down on either side, and then you come in with a chisel, and I'm just going to be blowing it out. I'm staying away from the line, and I'm actually aiming up. And some of this I will do bevel up, and some of it I'll do bevel down as we get close. I won't go all the way through. You see, I'm not blasting through the other side. I'm going to get down close to the edge, and then I can come back from the other side. A few of these I found, I need to cut them a little bit deeper. I also want to come in with a scrap piece and make sure that they actually fit in there. Most of these end up being a little bit tight, so I came in with a chisel and pared them a little bit wider. As long as I do them all at the same spot in the same place, then there isn't a problem. Remember, the most important thing is that these are all identical. And so here I'm just coming in with a slight shaving and paring it down until I get that fit I'm looking for. I want it to slide a little bit so that these can all go together, but I want it to be relatively close. And at this point, we can then come in with a router plane and take these bottoms down to the exact same thickness. This way, all of them are planed down to the halfway mark. Now, I set up the marking gauge to put the depth on this, and that marking gauge depth doesn't have to be dead on half. It's whatever I make on one, I'm going to use on the other stick and put it on the opposite side. So if I'm measuring from the top, I'm always going to measure from the top on both sticks. And I want to make sure that those are all the same. On the ends of these, we're going to cut off a 1/4 inch so that we have a 1/2 inch tab sticking out. And this 1/2 inch tab is what's actually going to be sitting on the floor on either side. So this will get rabbited into, or not rabbited, but dadoed into the frame all the way around. I'm going to just mark it off with the marking gauge and then come in and pare things out. I could come in with a saw and cut these down, but with a thin stock, I usually prefer to come in with the chisel and pop it out. These don't have to be beautifully perfect because they're actually going to be sitting on the floor. They'll just be glued into place. And so you can see how they would fit in there from end to end. They will be in pairs running across. And if that doesn't make sense, then just hang with me for a moment. A couple of them were just a hair too tight. They fit in one side and not the other, and they were just needed to be cut for their specific space. So then I came through and I marked them all, so I knew that these were 1, 2, 3 from one side. And then all of the small ones, I marked those as well, 1, 2, 3 from one side to the other. For the small pieces, we're basically going to duplicate everything we've done so far. And it's a lot of work to get here because you're just making a lot of the same things. And one of the downsides to hand tools is it's often faster to make one piece, but rarely do you ever need one piece for a project. You often have projects where you need 10, 15, 20. And when it gets to multiple pieces, it takes twice as long to make 2 and 3 times as long to make 3. And there are very few places where you can speed it up. There are a few, like gang cutting here, but a lot of these, it's just faster to make them with a machine if you've got it. But we're not going to do that. I'm kind of stubborn. So we're going to cut 10 of these. And we're going to put them all together and make sure that they're all running together. And I didn't want to clamp these in the bench because I found that they would pop out of place. So I squeeze clamped these together, and then we're going to do exactly what we just did before, except for on a smaller scale. And there's only 4 slots on these as opposed to 10 slots on the other. Doing the same thing over and over again. And you can see I'm coming in bevel down here. That allows you to reach in a little farther and allows me to balance it out. Running bevel down with a chisel gives you far more control, but it means that your force is going in a different direction than what you're shooting. And yes, I'm wearing safety glasses here because you can see these chips were just flying all over the place. There are times and occasions where safety glasses are very useful. And you may notice one of those little knobs broke off. Oh no, it's not a huge issue. In this case, if they break off, then I'll glue them back on. There's nothing structural to it. And a little bit of super glue goes out really, really well. Want to make sure that these are all cut down to the opposite thickness of what we cut from the other ones so that they overlap. If my line was exactly in the middle of the board, great. But as long as I measure both down from the top or both down from the bottom, that's all that matters. For the rabbet on either end, well, actually it's a rabbet in this orientation, or it would be a notch in the, we're cutting down doing the same thing here. Unfortunately, around this point I realized I'm going to end up making this really, really weak because my notch is parallel to it. I wish that I had cut them a little bit differently, but you live and you learn, and these really aren't as important as the long ones. The long ones are the ones that sit on the floor and carry all of the weight. These are more or less fillers for the look of it. So we're going to pare it back to that line. You need to be very, very careful when paring this. Some of this, the grain goes with it, and some of them, they go across it, and you just have to take your time. I love this little detail work where you're coming in and cleaning things out. And yeah, you'll see a couple of these that ended up breaking. And so we can add a little bit of super glue and put them back on. Now we can take it for the first test drive and see how these all fit together. They should be tight. They should take a little bit of work to get all the way down. And I'm really happy with how these came out. This is one of these projects that once you try it and you actually get them all to work, it is incredibly pleasing when these things fit down in there. And a little bit of slop is actually worth it so that you get that flex. And then we can fit it into place and get an idea of how it's going to look. Okay. And at this point, I'm getting excited. But we're going to have to take this apart and put it together, and take it apart and put it together many, many times. So let's make sure we label everything and check it all off so that we know what we're doing. We're going to put it back into the piece with the bottom up and then mark off where all these are. I'm putting a single mark into the board and then coming back with a square and extending that line all the way across. Once we get this on, I want to come in with a pencil and mark off between the lines. I didn't do that, and in some of these, they ended up being cut on the wrong side of the line because, oops. Now, on this one, I tried a bunch of different things, and I tried cutting in, but I was running into the other side, so you're only using the first 2 or 3 inches of the board. I ended up going with a Japanese saw because it has a smaller stroke to begin with, and I was running into all sorts of issues with the short sides running into the other side. Part of me thought I should have cut all these slots before putting it all together, but then it would be far less accurate, and I would have more problems with trying to fit it all together. Doing it afterwards means that I can just mark off of reality and not have to worry about measuring or acting. And I found that the Japanese saw actually worked a little bit better for the shorter stroke because it naturally has a shorter stroke than a Western saw. So we're going to cut these slots down to the appropriate depth, and we can check the reality and make sure that they actually cut down to it. This may seem very similar to what we did before because it is the exact same thing over again, just more router work. Again, if you had a table saw, this could be done really, really quickly because you'd be going all the way through from one side to the other and everything would be golden and happy, and I'm not, so hand tools. For the glue up, I'm going to be using epoxy on this. Why epoxy? Because there isn't much clamping force in this, and epoxy is great in applications where you don't need a lot of clamping force. PVAs require a lot of clamping force. We're going to be pushing everything down in and just letting it sit. I put a little bit of epoxy on top in some of the cracks, and once it all cured, then we can come through with the plane. And I'm going to be traversing this, but I'm going to be going at a 45-degree angle. That way all of my strokes cut at 45 degrees. That way it's not as horrible as going straight across, but I'm going to be getting a little bit of blowout on the backside of every one of these sticks. Just keeping that in mind, I'm taking a very shallow pass, a very light cut, and working it all the way down in. I want to do this on both sides to make sure that everything is nice and smooth. I want everything to be even with the top. And then for the final touch-up on it, I'm going to come through with a card scraper and do the little detail to smooth it all out. The card scraper is actually really useful when going across the grain, and I can bend it so I'm just hitting right in the middle. You'll see a little bit of wisp out on the far side, but with a tiny bit of sandpaper that cleans up very, very nicely. And I'm really, really happy with how this is coming out. You can see I have a 400 grit block sander, and that comes in and smooths them out nicely. With all of these holes, there are a bunch of little things that squeeze out and stick into the middle, and I found coming in with a little file to just detail them down and got rid of most of it. Some I had to come in with a small chisel and clean that out. I left the top outside face a little bit rough so that I could come in and detail that. And then again at the end, there was one little piece that broke off, and so I figured I'd just glue that back in. A little bit of CA glue, and that's good to go. In case this one's not actually structural, it's just one of those looking pieces. So now for the actual installation. We can bring this over, and I need to mark out on the floor where I need to cut. And so in this case, I decided to use blue tape. I'm going to cover the whole space with blue tape. That will allow me to cut the blue tape, and it gives me a very, very clear delineation between what is kept and what is gone. And it allows me to kind of work around this. So I'm laying it out to a little bit larger than it needs to be, and then coming in and filling the space in between. And then I can lay out the blue tape on the frame itself. And what this will allow me to do is glue it down on. Now, it's very rare that I ever use the glue and double tape. Most of the time I'm just going to use the double-sided tape. But in this case, I want the blue tape for the mark out, and so it was actually a great application for this. I can put it on here and let it sit and cure, and then we can come back and clean it out. So once it's fully cured, I'm going to come in with a knife and score it down, and this will cut into the wood and be the first cut and actually give me a nice sharp edge that it fits into, and I know that that line will be exactly where I need it to be. It ended up being a lot more work than I thought to peel this off. It was down there really, really good, and I had to dig in there with a chisel and the marking knife, and I finally got it loose. So we can peel this up, remove the masking tape from the inside, and this will give me a very nice clean line for exactly where I need to cut to get this to fit down in. Now, how to cut a hole. Normally, the historical way is to use a flooring saw, and I was recently like, happy, I just bought a flooring saw. I'm going to use this flooring saw, and I never thought maybe I should actually go make sure it's sharp and sharpen it. But I thought, I don't have time to sharpen it right now, but I'm just going to go ahead and use it. I just need to make 2 simple cuts. The other thing is that the flooring saw takes a lot of a different skill to learn because you're not cutting straight back and forth. You're actually rocking the saw, so you use different teeth at each time. And it's a fun thing, and I want to spend some more time on it. But in this case, we were on a deadline to get it down. So rather than doing that, we're just going to go through the simple chill. Oh, Luke, why did you put that video in there? Yeah, get rid of that. We don't want people to know I'm using a demon-possessed yellow brace. So for the end pieces, we're going to put a series of auger holes down through, and then we can come in and chop out. I'm not going to do the holes all along the line because that's with the grain, and those are actually relatively easy to just chisel out. It would have been a lot easier and cleaner and nicer if I had a good working floor saw, but I'm going to need to spend some time work that, and I'm going to do a video on that because I want to actually show the floor saw in use. It's a very interesting tool. It doesn't have a whole lot of applications, but sometimes when you need to cut a hole in the middle of a surface, it's actually kind of cool what it can do. So once I cut those holes, I'm going to go around the outside, and I'm just going to mark in. I'm going to stay a little ways away from my line. You can see there's some space between where I'm chiseling and where the line actually is. I want to bust some pieces out and leave some space in here. And some of these pieces were whole pieces of flooring, and some of them need just trimmed back a little bit more. So we could pry back to what we cut, and putting in that deeper stop cut there allows me to cut in a little bit farther without fear of it splintering back past. And one of these, right around that location, I actually had a knot. There wasn't a knot, but a twisted grain where I ended up chipping back off of the underneath the tape. So I had to glue a little piece back in. But at this point, we can test and see how it fits. It actually worked. First try, once I flipped it around and put it in the right direction. But that's why you need to make sure you mark it when you actually mark it out on the floor. And, it was right the first one, wasn't it? But yeah, in this case, it actually went in first try. You know what I mean. Very nice, clean fit. I was incredibly happy with this. But now we need to finish it.
All right, so it's ready to slide right in. I don't want to do that yet. That's going to look nice.
The last thing before finishing were just all these tiny little details. There were just little bits and bobs and wires sticking off, and I wanted to come in and clean those out. So some were with the chisel, some were with a fine file, some of them were with sandpaper, and we got it all cleaned down. The original floor was finished with water locks, but I didn't have any of that on hand, and I really liked the look of the wipe-on poly, but I soon realized that wiping it on wasn't going to work very well inside of all those holes. So I switched over to using a simple spray Minwax poly, and I really like how this comes out. It's unbelievably simple finish that anyone can do, and especially for something like this where you got all these holes to get into, it works out pretty well. I had put 7 coats on there, sanding in between every odd coat, and it worked out really well. Then we can pound it into the floor and just let it sit. Yes, I'm just going to let it sit. I'm not going to actually lock it down in because I might want to move it in the future. So there you go. Nice flooring, and I'm happy.
So there you have it, a vent. Finally got around to doing this. This is one of those projects that has been on the list for a while, and I told my wife, yeah, I'll do that. I'll get to it. 4 years later, it's there. So finally, I'm really happy with how this came out. Really, really, really nice. This is very pleasing, and I wish I had done it a long time ago. I actually wish I had done it when I did the floor and did it all right at the right time, but you live and you learn. So let me know your thoughts and comments. What would you do differently? Is there some particular design or style you would have liked to have seen? I'd love to hear that. I originally thought about doing something Kumiko in there, but I decided to go with something a little more early American Kumiko. But yeah. So let me know your thoughts, comments, snide remarks down below. Thank you. That helps out the channel. As well as anytime you hit the like, share, subscribe, thank you. You can take it even farther by all of these people over here. They are patrons on Patreon, because without patrons, we wouldn't be here. We are completely sponsored by you, and I get to do crazy things like this because you guys like watching this, so thank you. If you'd like to find out more about Patreon and support the channel, there's links to that down below, and I think that'll do it for now. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Okay, I'm sorry, everyone. I'm sorry I put you through that, but I'm just glad I could get that off my chest and vent for a little while.